This is part 1 of the Introduction to eGrants webinar, presented by FEMA Hazard Mitigation Specialists from FEMA Region 10 and FEMA Headquarters.
So today we are discussing eGrants. And for those of you who have not been in eGrants yet, it can be a little bit challenging to work in if you've never worked in it before, so that's why we offer this module.
There's kind of 3 components to eGrants in normal situations, but since we're talking about tribal applicants, it's really only 2. As far as the system is concerned, kind of use a tribe and a state is the same thing. So since most tribes apply directly to FEMA, I'm just kind of going to skip over some of that a little bit. The external portion of the system is for applicants, which would be your tribal government or states, territories, and of course tribes. So the sub-applicants in a normal scenario will create their project and planning sub-applications and submit those to their state or territory, and who prepares the grant application, and then the grant application with all the attached sub-applications is submitted to FEMA for review. But in the case of a tribe, they prepare their own sub-applications and attach it to their own grant and submit directly to FEMA. So the first thing, of course, is how do we get access to the system? You'll need a computer with internet access. You can see the address here on the screen. It's portal.fema.gov. Once you get to that screen, I think on the next page there is a graphic that shows the button that you click on for new non-PIV user. And there's also a video on how to do this, step-by-step walkthrough in the reference guide, and we'll go over it briefly here. You'll need to get an access code from your regional office. This is an important note at the bottom of the page. Changes in personnel are tough. Tribe needs to maintain user ID and passwords. The system functionality for tribal governments depends on your organization name and your email address. And if your organization name doesn't match exactly to your coworker or an incoming coworker, then you won't have the ability to share applications with each other. So when you go to portal.fema.gov, this is the page that you'll see. If you already have an account, of course, you would enter your user ID and password there. And if you're brand new to the system, you've never registered before, you'd click this link to create new non-PIV user. This is a common question to the help desk. People will say, I want to prepare my grant application, and they don't understand that it's a 2-step process. You need to create your project or your planning application or your management cost application, and those are attached to the grant application. The 2 main areas you'll be working as a tribal applicant would be grant applicant acting as sub-grant applicant and grant applications, all those guys down at the bottom. There is one thing you could use in administration, and that would be for looking up other users' emails or turning on and off pre-applications if you want to use those or not. But that would be really literally the only things it would be useful for a tribal applicant. Tribes applying directly to FEMA use the 3rd and 4th sections, grant applicant acting as sub-grant applicant and grant applications. There's only three things you can do as a sub-applicant or a grant applicant acting as a sub-grant applicant. You can create a new one, you can work on one that you haven't submitted yet, or you can work on one that you've submitted. If you have a successful grant that you're managing, you're going to be coming back to this work on submitted grant applications link frequently. Oh, yeah, there's the grant applicant homepage again. Like I said before, it's a two-step process. So for the sub-application, you're just going to be creating a project application or a planning application, and then create my grant application. I'll attach those to the grant application, and then attach the necessary forms and submit the grant application. This is the sub-grant applicant homepage.
So my part of the presentation right now is completing a project sub-application. And I'm focusing on a project sub-application rather than a planning or management cost sub-application because project sub-applications have the most content, the most things that have to be answered, the most things that have to be addressed. And I felt it would be very helpful simply to go through each one of the sections and kind of explain what's being asked for. So again, this first page is kind of some of the basics about working in sub-applications in eGrants. Develop your sub-application offline in a Microsoft Word document and then cut and paste into eGrants. There are blank sub-applications that you can print from the grant applicant homepage. Right up at the top of the grant application homepage, it's got a URL link for administration, and then it's got right below that, print blank applications. It's easier to make a change in your narrative in that Microsoft Word document and put it into eGrants. Because then you can make sure, oh, I made the change here. Let's see, maybe I need to change this section and this narrative or this answer to this question as well. I think it's easier to revise a product that you're working on and isn't final yet. And then step two, you start completing the various sections of the sub-application, filling in the information, pasting in the narrative from your offline MS Word document. And now here's some tips on navigating the online sub-application form that is live in eGrants. First of all, there's an application status screen, which we will show you in just a moment. And there are a bunch of links on the right-hand side under status, and there's also a bunch of links on the left-hand side under application status. You can click on either one of those to go to the section that you want to work on. What's cool about the right-hand column is it shows you whether you've already filled in that information and it's complete or not. Or if it's remaining to be filled in, it'll say incomplete. And we'll show you that in just a second. So you open a section, you start entering data. Down at the bottom of every section screen are a series of radio buttons that say go back, save, and save and continue. And there's a couple of sections in eGrants that actually have another radio button that we'll mention in a second. So save is often. That's the most important one, save and save often, as we always say. I can't tell you how many times I have lost data when I've been trying to help people, more so in the past, but even now, even today, when we do our initial reviews in eGrants for our part of the National Technical Review after all the applications are submitted, and you get interrupted on the phone, wow. Have I lost the data that I just entered into eGrants? It happens to us, it happens to you, it happens after 20 minutes. Just remember that. So when you're finished with that section and you're totally happy with it, you click the big radio button that says Save and Continue. That takes you to the next section. Or you can just click the Go Back and it'll take you back to that application status screen, and you can select a different section of the sub-application. Maybe the next one after the one you're working on you've already finished, so you need to go back there and you need to work on one further on down the sub-application form. So I've got a couple of notations here. Some sections have multiple pages to the section. For example, scope of work. So scope of work down at the bottom of pages 1 and 2 of the scope of work screen will also have save and continue to next page. So that keeps you within the scope of work, whereas save and continue would put you into the work schedule, which is the next section. There's another little item here that's very important to know, and that is, and we'll mention it again, this kind of unusual is in your work schedule screen, you have to click save each time you enter a task in order for you to be able to enter another task in. Otherwise, it just stays there and you can't do anything except the one you just entered. And my last note is if you do use the Go Back Radio button, be certain you save first. Okay, but this page shows you that application status screen. It shows you on the right which ones are complete, which ones are incomplete. That application section list that's there right in the middle of the screen is the same as the application status list on the left hand, except the left-hand list is all obviously URLs that will take you right into that section. So there's two ways to get everywhere you want to go. Now there's a caveat here. I just wanted to mention there are several subsections or sections that are shown in this particular screen that are now outdated. We've combined some things together. But don't worry about it. All we're trying to do is show you what the screen looks like, how to use it, how to get around. Okay, next slide, please. So now you have opened your sub-application. You've either created it or you've gone back into one you've already opened or created and you haven't finished, and so you want to go back into that. Or maybe you copied one from a prior year. That's a really cool feature of eGrants, is that you can pull up a sub-application that maybe you decided not to submit last year, or maybe you did submit that sub-application and there were problems with it and it was determined to be ineligible, but you still have all this wonderful data in that sub-application and you want to fix all those problems and resubmit it with this current fiscal year funding cycle. You can do that. So completing a project sub-application has several basic sections. Contact, this is the authorized agent, the financial point of contact. This is the person who we would prefer to be the person that presses the submit button in eGrants. It also is preferable to be the person that we go back to with any revision requests and that we're able to contact to resolve any concerns or issues that we may have. We recognize that that authorized agent will change over time, or it many times does at tribes and states and local governments, but we need to know who the person is to start off with. Community, you fill in all the boxes, there's a bunch of them, and then attach a community profile. We used to require that as content in eGrants, and we stopped doing that. But for tribes, we have found that it is very useful for a tribe to be able to tell a basic part of its story to enable the reviewers at the region to understand a little bit more about the tribe and what some of the challenges and the characteristics, demography of the tribe is, and that also works very nicely in the National Technical Review process as well. Now right here in red, DUNS number, the Dun and Bradstreet number for your tribe is required on every sub-application and every grant application form, okay? If you don't have a DUNS number, there's instructions on how to go about getting one. I'm going to wager that you all do have DUNS numbers because you get grants from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Indian Health Services, etc., and they probably, undoubtedly, require the same thing because that's how all federal grants are tracked by who gets the money so that we can prepare a report of all the different grants that are given to a particular tribe or particular local government. Mitigation plan. Remember, this is for a project sub-application, and for a project, you have to have a FEMA-approved hazard mitigation plan that is in place and effective on the application deadline date in order to submit a project. Here's where you enter the information about that plan. It's pretty self-explanatory. The one thing that I would ask is that when you do this, always try to remember to cite what part of the plan your proposed project is implementing. Okay, scope of work. We're going to get into that in specific details, but right now, that's basically the who, what, when, where, and why. We just did a project application webinar. There's a huge 80-slide PowerPoint on how to develop a project application that is available through that link that Brenda shared with you that you will have on the slide deck that you get or can download. You can go back and see the slides for that webinar, that PowerPoint, and you can even listen to it if you want to. So the first several questions in the scope of work section are title of the project, and here we kindly ask you to include the tribe's name and then the project name. I know that seems a bit redundant, but remember, we're getting grant applications and sub-applications from literally hundreds of different local government, state government agency, and tribal agencies and territories. It's just really helpful to make sure that your name is up there attached to that particular sub-application. The hazard to be mitigated, sometimes it can be multiple. There's a drop-down menu. For example, coastal relocation project could address coastal storms, tsunami, and ice jams. Mitigation activity. This is a bunch of different project type codes. It's got a drop-down menu. You can also select several. We recommend being very careful about that, however. I would focus only on the single one that reflects the majority of what you're doing with your project. And the reason for that is that eGrants will require a separate cost estimate for each mitigation activity that is selected at this point in preparing the scope of work section in eGrants. Okay, and a narrative, we're going to get into that. So the next section after scope of work is properties. So many projects have specific property locations, flood buyouts, elevations, generators. So maps and photos are absolutely necessary. We need information about each one of the properties, and you upload maps and photos of each property as appropriate there. I think there's a bunch of that that's fairly self-explanatory if you go through that. Okay, next slide, please. Then we have what we used to call a work schedule, which really is a work schedule. It's milestones for completion of the project, various tasks that need to be done to implement the scope of work activities. And then the next section is cost estimate. That, again, aligns with the scope of work activities. We put a streamlined budget in eGrants. Then we attach the detailed budget. We attached detailed budget documentation, and we attach a budget narrative. Okay? We'll talk about that some more, too. Match sources is the next section. Again, that's standard at 75-25% default. But many tribes qualify for a small and impoverished community cost share of 90-10. So it's 90 federal, 10 tribal. You recalculate that share. eGrants is going to come up with 75-25, but you force eGrants into using a 90-10 by inputting into the appropriate data field in cost share the actual dollar amount of your own calculation of what your tribal cost share would be, your 10% cost share. And then you enter that into that field, and then there's a little field, radio button beside it that says recalculate. You click recalculate, and voila, it will give you a 90-10 cost share, federal share, and local share. And that total should match what's in your budget. I'm going to mention this again, but a match commitment letter is a required attachment for all sub-applications. Cost effectiveness is the next section. This is where FEMA evaluates the benefit cost analysis that you have prepared for your project and ensures that there's a benefit cost ratio of 1:1 or greater. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Environmental historic preservation. There's a bunch of different environmental laws and acts that need to be addressed. You answer those questions, you upload appropriate maps or reports or other documentation for each one, photos, for each one of those sections as is appropriate. Many times there's only one or two of those environmental historic preservation sections that pertain to your project. That's okay. You can just note that this other one doesn't apply. Evaluation, that's the next section. There's a bunch of questions. We're not going to go over those, but that is for that is useful when your project is larger than the state tribal set-aside of $575,000 and you're putting it into the national competition. Maybe you want to do one of those $10 million Fed share resilient infrastructure projects. In the evaluation section is where you put in the data that helps improve your ranking when the competitive projects are all racked and stacked. There are many things that can improve the ranking, and it talks about that in there. And then comments and attachments. Sometimes that's for additional documentation, sometimes that you feel needs to be in there that you didn't know exactly where to put it. I will share with you that it's very useful sometimes to put some additional comments in there to explain some particular section or something that you didn't feel the question was asked in eGrants and you feel that FEMA needs to know that information. That's a great place to put it. Review and submit the sub-applications. We're talking the sub-applications at this point. So in order for eGrants to allow you to submit the sub-application, in other words, finalize it, it has to be 100% complete. In other words, we're going to show you the next page. There has to be a complete status for every single section of eGrants sub-application showing in the review and submit sub-application screen. Then you sign it with your eGrants password, you check the block, we'll show you that, and those actions submit the completed sub-application. Now, print it, save a PDF file offline. There's a period of time where you may not be able to see your sub-applications between the time they're submitted to FEMA and they're awarded or sent back to get revisions. So that can be a little confusing at times. I will be honest with you, I don't quite understand if that's how that works or not. I just know that I've had many tribes say, where is our sub-application that we submitted? Well, it's actually attached to the grant application, and if you go to work on submitted grant application, you can see your sub-application that way. But in any case, save, print, PDF it, so you know what you submitted. And guess what? That sub-application that you submit goes to who? Yourself. What happens is now that you've submitted it, that sub-application comes up on a list of sub-applications that you can attach to the grant application so that then you submit the grant application to FEMA. Okay, so you repeat all of this for each sub-application for different projects, plan update, management, costs, etc. And there is a, whoops. So down at the bottom is where you put your password in and you collect that you sign the application. In the status column on the right, everything has to say complete or eGrants will not allow it, and then you press the submit radio button on the bottom.
For a detailed walkthrough of sub-application sections, please view Part 2. To continue to instructions on attaching sub-applications to a grant application in eGrants, proceed to Part 3.